Hey folks, I'm JB Shreve, your host at the End of History podcast and jbshreve.com, where we help believers make sense of the chaotic world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of their times and the history that built those times. Today, we're in episode 27 of our deep dive into American history. This series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. We're looking at the Civil War in this episode, the past few episodes, and in the next few episodes. Now, a little word of warning, this episode is PG-13. We'll be getting into a few darker topics and stories today as we look at some of the battles of the Civil War, like Shiloh and some of the other ones. So if you're listening to this episode in a car with kids, things like that, just be aware of what lies ahead, and this may be one you want to not listen with kids around. Or not listen to with kids around. Remember, if you haven't been over to the website yet, you can go to theendofhistory.net or jbshreve.com, find loads of articles and recommended reads to go deeper into any of these topics that we'll be covering in this episode and the series as a whole. So you'll want to go ahead and check that out. I think that should do it. Let's go ahead and jump into this episode. I'm titling this one, War is Hell. That comes from a quote from one of the leaders of the Union Army during the Civil War, William Tecumseh Sherman. War is hell. So today, we're going to look at what he was actually referring to there.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So by the spring of 1862, the American Civil War had really already shattered hopes of a quick and bloodless conflict. When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, as you recall, when the armies clashed at Bull Run, many Americans on both sides, they imagined a short war that would end with, a single decisive victory. Politicians, newspaper editors, ordinary citizens, they spoke confidently about triumph coming. It's coming any minute. Young men, they enlisted expecting there would be adventure, there would be glory for them to take hold of. What followed instead was a level of destruction that neither Americans or really the world in general had ever witnessed before. The Civil War became the first modern industrial war fought on a massive scale. So you had railroads moving across, vast distances, telegraphs transmitting information almost instantly for the time period. This hadn't existed before. Factories supplied weapons in unprecedented quantities. But military tactics, with all of this technology that was really advanced for the time, military tactics hadn't fully adapted to these innovations. So generals continued to launch massed infantry assaults against increasingly lethal rifles and artillery. And so the end result of this convergence of technology with old world methods of warfare, the result was just slaughter. Prior to the Civil War, across the first half of the 19th century, the world looked to Napoleon as the military genius of the age. They looked Bolivar in South America. He hoped to replicate what Napoleon had done. Santa Anna in Mexico, he hoped to be the Napoleon of the West. Even George McClellan of the Union Army, he imagined himself as an American Napoleon. After this war, after the Civil War, people quit talking about Napoleon. The shape and nature of war was changed from this point forward. People who fought and led like Napoleon in this kind of fighting, and many did, well, they were slaughtered. They were killed. The first great shock came at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. It was fought in the forest of southwestern Tennessee near a church called Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh, that's where it gets its name. The Battle of Shiloh erupted when Confederate forces launched a surprise attack against Union troops commanded by Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant wasn't in charge of the whole army at this point. It's still kind of in tandem, and it's in flux as far as who's in charge of the Union Army, who's going to lead it forward in the years ahead. And Grant really wasn't on the radar just yet. And this surprise attack from the Confederates, it was rare for Grant to be surprised by this, or by things, to be surprised by his enemy. But it really set him off guard. The Union Army was caught off guard. And throughout the first day's desperate fighting, there was just unprecedented warfare that raged across fields, across woods, across ravines. One area became known as the Hornet's Nest because of the constant whine of bullets that could be heard. It just sounded like a nest of hornets constantly that these soldiers were marching through, were fighting through. By nightfall of the first day, thousands lay dead or wounded. The next morning, General Grant, he counterattacked and forced the Confederates to retreat. When battle ended at Shiloh, more than 23,000 men had been killed, wounded, or missing. And Americans were just stunned by those numbers. They would be today. I mean, imagine 23,000 people, 23,000 soldiers, American soldiers being killed in a battle today. The casualties exceeded those of all previous American wars combined in this single battle, this single 2 days of battle here. Newspapers carried endless lists of dead and wounded. Families searched desperately for news of their sons, of their brothers. In the book, Battle Cry Freedom, this is kind of like an authoritative account of the Civil War, one of the great ones here. But James McPherson, the historian and author, he writes about the aftermath of the battle. This is what he writes. He says, coming at the end of a year of war, Shiloh was the first battle on a scale that became commonplace during the next 3 years. The 20,000 killed and wounded at Shiloh, about equally distributed between the two sides, were nearly double the 12,000 battle casualties at Manassas, Wilson Creek, Fort Donelson, and Pea Ridge combined. Gone was the romantic innocence of Reb and Yanks who had marched off to war in 1861. And this is a quote within his quote. He says, I never realized the pomp and circumstances of the thing, called glorious war, until I saw this, wrote a Tennessee private after the battle. Men lying in every conceivable position. The dead, with their eyes wide open, the wounded begging piteously for help. I seemed in a sort of daze. Sherman, he's the Union general, described piles of dead soldiers, mangled bodies without heads and legs. The scenes on this field would have cured anybody of war. In his biography on Ulysses S. Grant, the historian Ron Chernow, highly recommend this biography, by the way, if you're interested in going deeper on these topics. But Ron Chernow, the historian, he describes the Battle of Shiloh with these memorable, these awful words. He says, on that stormy first night, 2,000 corpses lay strewn across a reeking battlefield that stretched for 12 square miles. In this nightmarish landscape, thousands of wounded men lay writhing and moaning in drenching rain, their contorted figures lit by sporadic lightning. The ground was slick with blood and carpeted with torn limbs and decapitated heads, wild pigs rooted among the putrefying bodies, their snorts audible to the dying soldiers. Meanwhile, Union gunboats anchored in the Tennessee River showered Confederate positions with shells, adding to the unearthly cacophony. Many soldiers died of exposure that night, while the living found no shelter as they slept in puddles. This night of horrors will haunt me to my grave, swore a Confederate soldier. End of quote. Later on in this series, we're going to look at the Indian Wars in the West after the Civil War. And I'm always struck by the inhumanity and just the psychotic butchery that many American military men carried out against the Indians, men, women, and children in the West in the decades that followed the Civil War. And I wonder sometimes if these soldiers were kind of driven insane by what they witnessed and experienced in battlefields like this at Shiloh during the Civil War. That kind of stuff had to take a toll on the human consciousness, on the human mind, the human soul. Grant emerged from Shiloh, General Grant, with both critics and admirers. Some condemned him for being surprised. His critics began calling him the Butcher, a nickname that would stick until the end of the war. Others recognized his greatest strength, determination. Unlike many commanders, Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, he refused to panic when events turned against him. He absorbed punishment. He adapted and continued pressing forward. This quality would eventually make him the Union's most successful general. But that would all come later. Before that time, politics and those political generals kept moving him further from action into the eastern theater of the war. We'll come back to him in the next episode and find him in Vicksburg, where he kind of builds his fame. But at Shiloh, he was called the Butcher after this. At the end of that first night of fighting, the first day of fighting, he's sitting under a tree or standing under a tree smoking a cigar. Grant smoked lots of cigars. And General Sherman comes to him, and they can hear the moaning of the dead or the dying out in the battlefield. This rain is coming. It's just a picture from hell in my imagination. That's what it would have to have looked like. and they're hearing these sounds all around them, imagining what's behind them, what's happened that day. And I can't remember the exact words that Sherman says, but he says something like, "We've had the devil's own day," or something like that to Grant. Grant just puffs on his cigar. He says, "We'll whoop them tomorrow." That was the way General Grant was. Very matter of fact. His followers, his soldiers could understand what he was talking about. That was probably one of the things that gave him the edge. But that's all to come. While Grant fought in the West, the Union's main army in the East remained under the command of George B. McClellan, who we looked at in the last episode. Now, McClellan, like we said, he was brilliant at organization. He did have that going for him. He transformed raw volunteers into the magnificent Army of the Potomac. His soldiers loved him, but he suffered from this fatal weakness for a wartime commander. He feared taking risk. McClellan, he consistently exaggerated Confederate strength. He convinced himself that he was always hopelessly outnumbered, even when intelligence suggested otherwise. He always remained cautious. President Abraham Lincoln, he grew increasingly frustrated with McClellan. Lincoln famously remarked that if McClellan was not going to use the army, he would like to borrow it. I've always loved that line. The consequences of McClellan's caution became evident during the Maryland campaign of 1862. Confederate commander Robert E. Lee, he launched an invasion of the North. All right, so Lee is going to invade the North, and that would hopefully discourage the Union from going further south, and it would end the war. All right, he was hoping to win a decisive victory not on Southern soil but on Union soil. Take the battle to the Union armies. Lee's army was divided, and they were vulnerable. Astonishingly, McClellan obtained a copy of Lee's operational orders. This is like this accident, another major what-if of history, but this major accident that McClellan actually got a hold of Lee's battle plan, and it revealed Confederate movements in detail of what was going to happen in this battle. Perhaps the greatest intelligence windfall of the war had been delivered right into McClellan's hands. But even with that, McClellan moved slowly. He hesitated. Lee's army, meanwhile, was living off the land, and the land, it wasn't providing that much. After eating too much green corn and apples, many were sick with dysentery. They were struggling to keep up with the general as he moved forward. The historian Alan Taylor, he records a Yankee civilian followed the track of Lee's army by the thickly strewn belt of green husks and cobs and a ribbon of dysenteric stool just behind them. Everything seemed set up for McClellan to win big here. He had Lee's plans in hand. Lee's army was sick and hungry with little to no civilian support. McClellan had 80,000 men here, while Lee had 50,000, even though McClellan claimed Lee had 120,000. He was always imagining his enemy was far more outnumbered him than what the reality was. So the armies finally collided September 17th, 1862, at the Battle of Antietam near Sharpsburg, Maryland. Now, this battle gets its name from a nearby creek. As bad as Shiloh was, Antietam was even worse, at least in a single day it was. Antietam was the bloodiest single day of American history. Shiloh's worse because it went more than one day. Antietam was the bloodiest single day of American history. The fighting began before dawn in the fields of corn. Entire regiments vanished in minutes as artillery shells exploded among the stalks. Men fired at enemies only yards away. The cornfield changed hands repeatedly as thousands of men fell to their death in battle. The historian Bruce Catton, he describes the fighting in the cornfield, and he writes, "A wild, primitive madness seemed to descend on the men who fought in the cornfield. They went beyond the limits of sanity and endurance at times, Northerners and Southerners alike, until it seemed that they tore at each other for the sheer sake of fighting. The slaughter there, it shifted to a sunken farm lane that became known forever as Bloody Lane. Confederate defenders poured devastating fire into advancing Union troops. Bodies piled upon bodies, and eventually Union forces broke through, leaving the road filled with dead and wounded. Farther south, Union soldiers attempted to cross a stone bridge under intense fire. That crossing became immortalized as Burnside's Bridge. Again and again, these attacks failed. The creek below filled with casualties. When darkness fell, approximately 23,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. A father who rushed to the battlefield after the fighting to see if his son had survived, he wrote, "The long battle had traveled like one of those tornadoes which tear through their path through our fields and villages." That's what it must have looked like. In his biography on Robert E. Lee, the historian Alan Gelzo, he opens his chapter after the conclusion of the Battle of Antietam with these words: "The most terrific battle that ever was fought on this continent has been going on all day near Sharpsburg," reported the New York Tribune. And although it had closed without a definite result, there were rumors that Lee and Longstreet had been killed, or that Longstreet and Powell Hill were prisoners, that the ammunition and provisions of the rebels had been completely run out, and that everything was favorable for the renewal of fighting in the morning. In fact, Lee and Longstreet were quite alive, and Longstreet and Hill were not prisoners, but that was almost the only good news for the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee was prepared to fight. He was prepared to go at it again the second day, but McClellan held back. To Lincoln's ongoing aggravation, rather than pushing to destroy Lee's army here, McClellan celebrated as though he had won the fight. He wrote letters home describing how he had fought the battle splendidly and that it was a masterpiece, that's his words, quoting from his letters, and that he had defeated Lee so utterly and saved the North so completely. Reading again from Alan Taylor's book, this is a quote from Taylor's book. He says, "Possessed of a rich fantasy life, McClellan did not want to lose his masterpiece by fighting the next day. A relieved Confederate officer marveled that McClellan lacked the commonest kind of everyday common sense for failing to renew his attack on a battered army, backed against a river with no bridge and only one fort. That night, Lee's army escaped across the Potomac to Virginia. A Union soldier complained that McClellan's failure to pursue prolongs this horrid war. Both commanders had botched the campaign, Lee by advancing into Maryland and seeking battle from a weak position, McClellan by failing to make Lee pay for his mistakes." Although tactically inconclusive, Antietam, the bloodiest day of the war, the bloodiest day of American history, Antietam forced Lee to retreat into Virginia. European observers decide the battle as a draw between the two sides, but tactically, they said Lee won the battle, tactically. In their view, he had won it since he was outmatched and he survived. Lincoln remained furious that McClellan had failed again to destroy Lee's army. Once again, the cautious general had allowed a battered enemy to escape. Shortly afterward, Lincoln removed McClellan from command. If McClellan represented caution, Lee represented audacity, and Lee understood that the Confederacy's resources were limited. He couldn't simply trade losses with the larger and the wealthier North, so instead he relied on this aggressive maneuver, these bold attacks, and the remarkable talents of his subordinate, Stonewall Jackson. And as we've seen, Jackson possessed an uncanny ability to move troops rapidly and strike unexpectedly. His soldiers called themselves Jackson's foot cavalry, because of the astonishing distances that they could march. Together, Lee and Jackson formed one of history's most effective military partnerships. Their masterpiece, it came at Chancellorsville in May 1863, facing a Union army more than twice the size of its own. Lee, the head of the Confederate Army, he made a decision that military professionals considered reckless at the time. Instead of retreating, he divided his army in the presence of a superior enemy. He basically made them weaker, but more mobile, right? Then he divided it again. The Union commander, General Joseph Hooker, he possessed every advantage in numbers and position at this point, once Lee did this. But Lee recognized hesitation in his opponent and exploited it ruthlessly. Stonewall Jackson, undertook one of the most famous flank marches in military history. Concealed by woods and guided by local knowledge, his corps marched around the Union Army and struck its exposed right flank in the afternoon. And that attack unleashed just utter chaos. Union soldiers were cooking supper, resting, or playing cards when thousands of Confederates suddenly burst from the trees. The entire formations collapsed. Panic spread rapidly. Men fled through the camps, abandoning equipment and weapons, and the victory seemed complete until tragedy struck. While returning from that reconnaissance mission after dark, and we alluded to this in the prior episode, but Jackson, he was mistaken for Union cavalry and shot by his own men in all this chaos. Severely wounded, he underwent the amputation of his left arm. Pneumonia followed. 8 days later, he died. And of course, Robert E. Lee, General Lee, he mourned deeply. Upon hearing of Jackson's injury, we know he famously remarked, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." Chancellorsville ranks among Lee's greatest victories, but it came at a terrible cost. The Confederacy had won a brilliant battle, yet lost one of its irreplaceable leaders. For my money, and obviously I'm no military expert, but when I look at what follows in the story of the Civil War, when I look at Robert E. Lee's successes versus his failures, I see Stonewall Jackson as the real military genius, not Robert E. Lee. After Stonewall's death, Lee was increasingly just fighting to survive, and he's still doing it against weak Union generals by this point in the war. The Battle of Chancellorsville, it also demonstrated the changing nature of warfare. Massive armies maneuvered across entire regions, while concentrated rifle fire and artillery inflicted catastrophic casualties. Military observers from Europe, they studied the conflict real close. Many had expected American amateurs to perform poorly. Instead, they witnessed the campaigns whose scale rivaled the great wars of Europe. Then came Fredericksburg. December 1862, Union General Ambrose Burnside attempted to cross the Rappahannock River, and advance towards Richmond. Delays allowed Lee to occupy strong defensive positions on the heights behind the town. The Confederate line was nearly impregnable. Still, Burnside ordered attack after attack. Union soldiers emerged from Fredericksburg streets and advanced across open ground toward a stone wall at the base of Mary's Heights. Behind the wall stood Confederate infantry supported by artillery, and the result was just carnage. All right, utterly wasteful carnage at that. Wave after wave of Union troops moved forward. Wave after wave was shattered. One Confederate officer later recalled that it seemed impossible for any living thing to survive the storm of bullets. Union soldiers fell by the hundreds. Some advanced almost to the wall before being cut down. Others sought shelter behind slight depressions in the ground and remained pinned throughout the night. By day's end, the field was once again covered with bodies. The Union suffered more than 12,000 casualties. Confederate losses were a fraction of that number because they were behind the walls. It was just a target shoot for them. The seemingly pointless carnage deflated support for the war among civilians in the North and offered even more demoralization for the Union soldiers. One of the survivors wrote a letter home saying, "I am sick and tired of disaster and the fools that bring disaster on us." As battles mounted, both Northern and Southern societies, they started to profoundly change. In the North, early enthusiasm for the war gradually gave way to this grim determination. Every community felt the war's impact. Casualty lists filled newspapers, hospitals overflowed, families mourned sons who would never return. But the North's industrial strength, the growing military effectiveness, and commitment to preserving the Union sustained the war effort. The South experienced an even more dramatic transformation. Initial confidence born from victories like Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and even Chancellorsville, it slowly eroded under the pressure of prolonged conflict. Inflation was soaring in the South. Supplies became scarce. Entire regions were stripped of food and livestock. Nearly every family had a relative serving in uniform. Unlike many wars fought against distant nations of unfamiliar enemies, the Civil War was a conflict between people who often knew one another personally. The nation had been one country only months before the first shots were fired. Soldiers who now faced each other across battlefields had attended the same schools, worshipped in the same churches, served together in the U.S. Army, even belonged to the same families at times. The war's violence was made more painful because it often pitted friend against friend, brother against brother, or cousin against cousin. Before the war, Lee had served alongside such men as George McClellan and Winfield Scott. They had shared military posts, meals, and friendships. General Longstreet, on the Confederate side of the fighting, he was actually a groomsman in Ulysses S. Grant's wedding 13 years before the war. When the war came, loyalty to state and nation pulled friends and comrades into opposite sides of the battlefield. Even more heartbreaking were the divisions within families. Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and other border states became especially divided. In Kentucky alone, hundreds of families sent sons into both armies. The family of U.S. Senator John J. Crittenden, he became a symbol of the nation's fracture. One son, George Bibb Crittenden, fought for the South, while another, Thomas Leonidas Crittenden, fought for the North. The war even reached the highest levels of government. Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, she came from a Kentucky family that split over the conflict. Several of her brothers fought for the Confederacy. Some died in Southern service while she lived in the White House supporting the Union cause. At the Battle of Gettysburg, which we're going to look at in the next episode, Union and Confederate soldiers occasionally recognized familiar accents, hometown names, or even former neighbors shouting from opposing lines. In some instances, soldiers changed, they would exchange newspapers. They would exchange tobacco at the front lines in between the battles. They would have brief conversations across picket lines before returning to battle. And these moments revealed that the enemy was often not a stranger, but someone whose life had once been closely connected to their own. The Civil War's casualty list carried an added burden because every death represented not merely the loss of a soldier, but the tearing apart of relationships. And the war demonstrated that the deepest wounds a nation can suffer are often inflicted not by foreign enemies, but by divisions among its own people. Few conflicts in American history have so vividly illustrated the sorrow of a house divided against itself. And that was what Abraham Lincoln had warned about. A house divided against itself cannot stand. The South was holding its own, maybe even winning the war by the second year of fighting. Southern victories brought pride, but they couldn't replace manpower. Pride doesn't replace manpower. It doesn't replace industrial resources. Every battlefield success came at the cost that the Confederacy struggled to absorb. The psychological transformation was equally profound. The romantic vision of war that had inspired so many volunteers in 1861 largely disappeared. Soldiers who had dreamed of glory now confronted mud, disease, exhaustion, and death. Medical advances had not kept pace with weaponry. Wounded men endured amputations without modern antiseptics. Disease killed hundreds of thousands. In fact, disease killed more than bullets did during this war. Battlefield photographers brought images of death directly into American homes for the first time, confronting civilians with the war's reality. By 1863, Americans understood that this conflict was unlike anything they had expected, anything they had ever known. Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, they revealed both the strengths and the weaknesses of the war's most important commanders. McClellan's caution repeatedly squandered opportunities. Grant's resilience and determination hinted at the future course of the war. Robert E. Lee's boldness produced remarkable victories despite overwhelming odds. Stonewall Jackson's speed and aggression made him one of the conflict's most feared commanders. Most importantly, these battles transformed the American understanding of warfare itself. The Civil War demonstrated that industrial societies could mobilize entire populations for war, and it showed how technology could magnify destruction on an unimagined, unprecedented scale. It shattered assumptions about quick victories and glorious campaigns. Americans entered the war believing courage alone could determine outcomes. They emerged recognizing that modern war demanded not only bravery, but also immense resources, demanded national endurance and a willingness to endure an unimagined, unprecedented sacrifice. Now, in our next episode, we're going to turn our gaze to the turning point of the war, the Battle of Gettysburg. And I'll explain why this was so significant and how it began to reboot a new moral foundation for the American nation. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at The End of History, where we help believers make sense of the world they're living in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that made those times. We'll be back real soon with the next episode in this series, The Empire, a 250-year American story.